What's up, everyone? Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Rena Sherbill, host of the Cannabis Investing podcast and senior editor for Seeking Alpha. Hello, Rena Sherbill. How are you?
I'm doing well, Kevin. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. I know that you're hitting the end of your day because you're based in Tel Aviv, Israel. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Although I would like to think that this is at the end of my day, but yes, the sun is about to set. So let's put it like that. But I do like to have business with people all over the world. So my hours do get extended later and they come on earlier, but I'm happy to be talking to you right now.
Yes, well, we're excited to have you on the show. Um, before we get into obviously your background and what you currently do, which is you're the host of the Cannabis Investing podcast on Seeking Alpha, and you're also a senior editor for Seeking Alpha. Um,
Yep.
but before we get into cannabis investing and whatnot, let's just let our audience get a sense of who you are and your background. How did you get that title, and how did you get started in the cannabis industry?
So I very fortuitously started at Seeking Alpha like at the beginning of September 2008. So for followers of the stock market, that's when, or even just followers of news, actually, that's when like the world crashed with the big financial crisis. And I had started at Seeking Alpha. It was my first job in the finance world. Prior to that, I had done a bunch of PRs, a lot of freelance journalism, book reviews, mostly covering cultural aspects, not the finance world, not the economy. And then just prior to Seeking Alpha, I had worked for a film distribution company in Israel, distributing small independent film, mostly documentaries. But I wanted to pivot, learn something new, make a little bit more money, as those freelance writers know. And I heard about Seeking Alpha. I thought what they were doing is great, which is basically crowdsourcing a lot of people's opinion and analysis on the market. So it's not as dry as people who are new to that field. A little bit more irreverent, especially at the time. It was, a total startup. So more like the wild west in terms of the coverage that was happening, especially as the world was falling apart and new paradigms were maybe being thought of, if not enacted in actuality. But anyways, so I started in 2008. I was just your garden variety editor, and then slowly kind of found my way. I now head up all the content that comes from non-exclusive sources. So people that are writing on their blogs, or people that have something to say that distribute it in a newsletter, or they just want to distribute it on Seeking Alpha, but it's not necessarily exclusive content. So I basically curate and manage that content. And also, if anybody out there is looking to write a great article on the market, but also specifically cannabis, we're always looking to build our content that way. And then a little over a year ago in April, there was a cannabis conference called Canatech, which is one of the foremost conferences. And Israel is, we're kind of one of the original countries to go medically legal. And, it has a long history with cannabis, Israel, with Professor Meshulam as being one of the professors to isolate the THC compound. So a lot of history with Israel. So one of the foremost conferences. I just started kind of like doing news podcasts at Seeking Alpha, and really love the format of it, as I'm sure you do too, since you're starting your own podcast. There's something special about this format that I think if you have something to say or want to interview people that have something to say, it's a great format. So my colleague Jonathan Liss and I went to cover that conference, and what was supposed to be like a few off episodes, here we're covering this conference, we realized pretty shortly thereafter that there's a world of coverage to be done by Seeking Alpha in terms of the investing scene in cannabis. I really do feel, and I'm not a hyperbolic person, I really do feel this is one of the opportunities in our lifetime, especially in terms of investing, but just in terms of this paradigm shift that's happening with cannabis becoming thought of as, more of a health and wellness product than anything else. So I'm really excited to kind of be part of Seeking Alpha. I think gives the cannabis investing world a tad more legitimacy. Many people are pushing forward the cannabis as at the forefront of investing, but also at the forefront of, doing social good and improving lives and improving ridiculous, awful policies that have been enacted for way too long. So anyways, long answer short, I feel like I'm really happy to be kind of giving voice to the cannabis industry to people that may not have taken it as seriously, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of things there. The last point you made, I can't agree with you more in terms of these outdated laws that have just inhibited the potential of the plant, both from an economic standpoint, when it comes to the non-consumable products that can be made from hemp, but also the medicinal benefits of the cannabis plant when we really start to research and learn more about the cannabinoids and the properties that and the value that they add. But stepping back a little bit, so Seeking Alpha. So I'll be honest, I am what you'd say a beginner when it comes to cannabis investing or investing overall in that regard. The first time I really started dabbling in the market is with cannabis exclusively. So I was just, that was like, I kind of course, like I said earlier before we started recording, I've been an advocate for many years now. During the pandemic, I felt like it was a great time to start this podcast, given the time at home that we're all spending and the listener potential, right? Of just the education potential of the plant that we can disseminate. So, yeah, I mean, I want to talk about kind of just everything when it comes to cannabis investing. Like you mentioned in 2008, you saw the potential. So is that when some of the first companies started to be listed?
No, 2008 predates my even knowledge of the serious cannabis, and I think it predates the real existence of any of the real companies. I think it's more. Look, I mean, when Canada went legal, that was kind of the beginning of, like you're talking about Aurora Cannabis and Canopy Growth. I would say those are probably two of the best known stocks that were able to then be listed on a major market.
What year?
So I would say that's like, I think we're talking about like 2014, 2015.
Okay.
And again, there are people that are a lot more knowledgeable than I about the exact history of things. I also come in late to the game. I also have just been covering it for a couple of years. And as you said, before we started, there is so much to cover. I mean, I know people whose only job is to invest other people's money in cannabis stocks. And that is a straight up full time, you could work yourself silly just doing that. So anybody that has a slightly different part of their job, it's not just focused on cannabis, you're missing something because there's so many cannabis stocks out there. Go ahead, I can see you.
And most people that or even have a basic understanding of the market, they know that the market fluctuates, right? But specifically in the cannabis market, it seems like the fluctuations are like, I mean, you cannot predict what's going to happen day to day, especially during the COVID pandemic, which we can cover later on. But does the cannabis market, does it differ in that way compared to other industries in terms of how much it fluctuates, or not, or no, it doesn't?
I think most, sound experts will tell you it's a lot like the .com, bubble that was built and then burst, at the cusp of the millennium. Because look, just like with the internet, we didn't know exactly what the internet was. Okay, you could describe to us what it meant, but like, were we going to be buying airline tickets on the internet? Were we going to be buying formula? Were we going to buy, movie tickets? Like, there was so much that a lot of people maybe first saw, but a lot of people had no idea, and how that leads to then the products that have to do with the internet and smartphones and all these things that we couldn't necessarily foretell, but you knew something big was happening. There were going to be companies that made a bunch of money. It was just kind of hard exactly to know what those companies were, and also because the kind of killer app for journalism students, hadn't yet been developed. And I think kind of similarly to cannabis, I mean, obviously what's going to bring in the revenue is selling flower and selling, oils and selling edibles. But how are those going to be sold, and which company is going to be making the most money? But also, most importantly, it's federally illegal in the States, which is the biggest market. So with all these laws coming at you, it's definitely going to be a more volatile industry than, let's say, the agricultural industry or the telecom industry, because the laws are still being figured out and the companies are still figuring themselves out. I think, as a new investor, you have to see how many different kind of changes have come about in the cannabis industry, even in just a year. Like last year at this time, everybody, or even a few months ago last year, people were super excited about the Canadian, these big Canadian players and what they were going to do, and these huge capital infusions from like these alcohol companies like Constellation and Molson, and everybody thought, well, you can't go wrong, but the money was not managed as well. A lot of money was spent on buying up all these assets. A lot of sexy headlines were put out there, a lot of exciting deals, and a lot of that didn't come to fruition, or not at the kind of advantageous rates that maybe a better run or more established company might have put themselves out there. In any case, I don't want to I'm getting ahead of the question you asked, but in terms of knowing that this is going to be a more volatile industry than your average industry, I would say definitely expect that, just because there are so many variables that we can't account for at this point in the cycle of this sector, I think.
Yeah, well, to echo what you're saying, that's been explained by various guests on this podcast from different disciplines, right? So, like yesterday, I had Mark Wasserman on from Pot Brothers at Law, and he's just talking about the taxation in California to start a recreational THC business is huge, right? I think I don't know, I think it's in the high 30s, even close to 40% of just taxes alone. And then you talk about, I had another guest on who was a edible business owner, and she talked about the banking laws or the banking institutions and how difficult it is to work with some of them, just because either they won't work with you at all because you're cannabis, and of course it's listed federally as a Schedule 1 narcotic. But also you could be working with a bank and then they kind of shut you off, right? So to your point, there's legalities, there's banking issues, there's new laws and regulations and reforms that are changing every day. At a state level, some counties and cities allow it, some cities and counties don't. So I can't imagine, right? And that's just the US. So now let's talk about other countries. It seems like you said, Israel is more friendly. Are they recreational? Is it just medical? And then how about Canada and other countries?
Well, very timely question for Israel, because it's literally playing out in the front pages right now in Israel. It's been medically legal here, I want to say, since 1996. So we have a strong foothold in the medical market, but I would say in the past couple of years, they are really, people are falling over themselves how to kind of mess this up as much as you can, because I think the public support is there. I would say they have a lot of political support as well. Our government has its own problems separate from the cannabis industry, a lot to be desired in general. But I think the cannabis specifically has been it's been in fits and starts. So I think about a year ago, you couldn't get arrested anymore for having smaller than 15 grams, but you would pay a fine. And now they're just passing a bill in the ministry, I think is how you translate Knesset. That's like our Senate, that I think would need two more approvals, but is on the path to be decriminalized. And it's backed by the prime minister. So you get the feeling that this is like at the highest levels wanting to be pushed through. And I think what you said about COVID in terms of COVID just affecting things, I would say here too, and I would say globally, I think a lot of people, most people are dealing with huge economic, crash, recession, depression, what have you, whatever word you want to describe it as. So I think governments and municipalities are looking at ways to kind of boost the economy. Cannabis is a really obvious way to boost it, especially somewhere like Israel where it's kind of the cogs are all in place. You kind of just need to put a stamp of approval, but you have your growers, you have your distributors. They already had changed the laws that I believe it used to have to come from the Ministry of Health, or I'm going to get that wrong, so I don't want to say, but there was a relaxation of who can now prescribe cannabis. So I think it's slowly getting there. I think we're pretty close. A lot of people seem to be extremely optimistic. I mean, my phone was blowing up 2 days ago. Is this happening? Is this happening? Is this happening? I would love to think that it is. I would also love to think that they do it right instead of half right, which I think a lot of places have done. Yeah, I mean, you were saying about California and kind of well, first of all, the tax issue is insane, which is why I think the black market is still so huge in California. But another conference I went to was in LA, and somebody on, it was like a law panel, and they were saying, the advice they give to cannabis owners is to email the county and the state the same email, so they're forced to deal with their conflicting laws, which is like brilliant and also insane. So
Well,
I hope, yeah.
to piggyback on that, that's what Mark was saying yesterday. So he said that when they first started, I forget the proposition number in California, but this is way back in I think 2008 or something, is when they allowed non-for-profit businesses to deliver cannabis or grow cannabis plants for patients who had a doctor's prescription, right? But they had to be not-for-profit. So basically what him and his brother did is Mark was on the criminal side, his brother was on the corporate side. They basically worked together to put a playbook together that says, here's what you need to do to set this entity up. And then when you get busted, which you will, because it's deemed a felony at a state level and a federal level, you will get busted. Here's what you can do to get out of it and not lose anything, right? So it's so funny how people are just kind of being proactive in these ridiculous laws to bypass them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, you see somebody that's starting a cannabis company and you're already like, well, okay, you're going to have to go through a lot. You're going to talk about volatility, as an owner of a company or as somebody who's heading a company, you have to be in it in terms of knowing that you are going to have to pivot and be nimble in ways that you probably never thought you would have to. Yeah, it's pretty crazy out there.
It is. So, well, let's switch gears and talk specifically about cannabis investing. So, someone like me who's a beginner, dabbling, or even hasn't started yet at all, what should they look for and think about, especially during these times of COVID?
So here's what I would say. I think, well, I would say specifically in this time, given that we're, with COVID deeming, I think everybody probably listening to this podcast knows that in the States it was deemed essential, that cannabis was deemed an essential item in most places, in most municipalities, I think with the exception of a couple of counties. So I think that was huge for the industry. I think a lot of people were worried, well, what's COVID going to do? What if all these stores are closed and how are cannabis companies going to make any money? And when it was deemed essential, I think a lot of people understood, okay, this is in a way that people even already understood that the train has already left the station. I think it just further cemented that. And even during this time of global pandemic and not really knowing what's going to be, the fact that cannabis was allowed to like remain a constant in people's lives, I think speaks to the understanding that legislators have, that doctors have, and that the average person has in terms of how much cannabis gives to people in terms of lowering anxiety, in terms of, I mean, whatever, all the things that we understand cannabis to be able to give to people. So I think that was huge. And I think for investors specifically, I think it also allowed them to understand that cannabis, even in the States and something in a country where it's federally illegal still, we understand that it's just a matter of time before those laws catch up to society. So I think it was a huge vote of confidence. But again, like we were talking before we started, and I was asking, how you chose the stocks that went in your portfolio, because I am curious how when people just starting out, there's so many stocks to choose from. How do they choose? And I think the most conservative, maybe piece of advice is to go for an ETF, which is one trading vehicle where you have a number of stocks that is thematic based. So, if you're focused on medical cannabis companies or ancillary companies, which are companies that don't necessarily touch the plant, but have to do with the industry in, if it's packaging or security or what have you. So that would be the most cautious advice. I'm not a fan of that advice because I feel like, first of all, you're missing out on the US players because the US isn't federally legal. So the ETFs won't have those stocks as part of their basket of holdings. So I think you're missing out there. And then I think, you just don't get to play the game as much if you're in a fixed ETF that has the holdings already kind of set out for you. So the advice I like to give, and we talk about this a ton on our Cannabis Investing podcast, the number one thing is management, and you have to look at management and how it sounds super basic, and because it is, but I think also probably the most salient thing about investing is you're investing in somebody's vision of their company, and you have to like what that person stands for and be pretty sure that they're not doing anything nefarious. I think we've seen that come down from the cannabis companies. Now I would say this year has been the shakeout in terms of, you look at companies like MedMen, who spent like a crazy amount, who had these really cool, awesome commercials, who had this great, publicity campaign in California. But they spent irresponsibly, and the company, the founders were just, I think yesterday, now they're not even on the board. They were ousted as the CEOs, but now they're not even on the board. And there are a number of other companies like CanTrust in Canada. They ran afoul of a number of, regulations there, and they didn't maneuver as fast as they should in terms of compensating for that, in terms of writing it. We're seeing Acreage, which is one of the biggest U.S. players and a company that a lot of people, even a few months ago, were saying, it's the most politically connected. They're going to have the easiest time in terms of pushing through what they want to push through. And then, Acreage's kind of philosophy was buy up a ton of existing cannabis companies, get them all under your umbrella, and then you kind of own the whole playground. So how can you miss? But they kind of are missing, and they just did a deal where they're paying, I think, 60% interest on the loan they just took out. So I think you have to watch for companies that are spending hand over fist, but in a really disadvantageous way. The terms of the debt they're taking on, or if they're having to pay back, how are they having to pay back? So I would say, Matt, yeah.
When you're researching, when you say management, right, of these companies, like, I mean, like just a basic Google search, or maybe like looking up their LinkedIn profiles, I guess, press releases, seeing what are there trends for some of these terrible executives that are running these businesses? Like, are they coming from different industries and really don't know the cannabis market? Like, what can what can people look out for, or what type of research can they do when it comes to these leaders at these companies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there are, yeah, basic Google searches and LinkedIn and checking, where they're coming from, and obvious things are going to jump out at you for some of them. But some of them, I think what I found when I was first getting started in the sector is reading or listening to the earnings calls. You can really pick up a lot of kind of where people are coming from and what their focus is on. And even with especially well, first of all, there are companies that don't do question and answer sessions in the earnings call, which I always find, I would say maybe one step below troubling. I always want the management to be answering questions that aren't prepared for them. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And the second thing is just hearing somebody, it's the same as having somebody come on the podcast. I mean, people can put out a press release and have prepared remarks, and even they can have a few sound bites ready to answer like some questions that they're sure to be asked. But I think you can also glean a lot from how a person answers, what they leave out, if they're putting things on something else, if they're being, if they're obfuscating, if they're not like being completely straightforward, or if they're just really highlighting all the good things. And that's something I, as kind of an interviewer, I myself sometimes don't know how to handle that when I can tell somebody's really just giving me kind of all the press release soundbite kind of lexicon. Sometimes it's hard to parse in there, but I always think to myself, if that's all they're giving me, there might be something else. And it's always worth digging, I think, a little bit more. So I would say, yeah, those are my best. And especially now in terms of executives being so public facing, they're giving a bunch of interviews, and there are things that you can, I think, find out from that, but also see how much the balance sheet matches up to what they're describing. Like if you see a headline that says, company Y just signed a deal for like 3 acquisitions, and investors are like, oh wow, that sounds amazing, oh wow, that sounds amazing, and the stock goes up. But then if you dig into those deals and you're like, well, wait, that doesn't sound like a very advantageous deal. Or if they only have, 30 million on the balance sheet, how are they doing this deal worth 50? Like all those, I think in no other sector is it more true how much due diligence you need to do on cannabis companies, because especially if you're just starting out in investing. And I know, I'm sure you having a cannabis podcast, people are all the time asking you about like cannabis, and they read the headlines and they're asking you what's really going on or what's the real story. Like, I think investing right now in cannabis are getting so much play because of kind of these huge numbers and in terms of COVID, what that's brought to people's interest. But you still have to be smart. It's not just like, oh, it's a cannabis company. Yeah, they're going to do great because they're a cannabis company. You still have to do the banal due diligence.
Yeah, it truly is the wild, wild west that we're living in right now when it comes to cannabis, because you've got so much public support for it at this point.
Right.
You have federal legislation that condemns it, and then you have states that are operating and selling it recreationally. And then with the 2018 Farm Bill and the hemp and mass cultivation of hemp being now available to farmers, it's just so sporadic and all over the place. It's so crazy. And that's
Yeah.
but that's what makes it, I guess, kind of fun at the same time, and I want to touch on that, but I do want to answer your question. So like beginners like me, what I've done in terms of my portfolio is I'm not lying here. I have used Seeking Alpha. I have a good friend, Sandesh, shout out to Sandesh, who uses Seeking Alpha. He's big into investing. And so when I was first learning about it, he recommended that app, just because of what you're talking about in terms of how, all the opinions and reviews are all curated. It's not as biased as what you'd get from other platforms or media companies or investing companies. So
Yeah.
Seeking Alpha has been great. You can set alerts. You can follow different stocks and companies. But another thing is like I'll look at advertising, like I'll look at partnerships. So, for instance, I had a membership at a gym, Lifetime, and they are a big partner of CBD MD. So
Okay.
I kind of looked into them and I saw, well, if Lifetime's partnering with them and they're a legitimate company, right? And they're doing well. So I kind of base it off of like partnerships, what I'm seeing based off the research from resources like Seeking Alpha. And then, I mean, I'll also look at press releases also. I mean, I know being in digital marketing and working for large corporations, to your point, I know that there's a lot of fluff in those press releases for the most part, and it's always kind of just showcasing the good news. But like you said, if you can do some digging and see why they made certain decisions, like an acquisition or a merger or whatever it is, you can really get to the bottom of it. So
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, to your point with Seeking Alpha specifically, and I have a Twitter feed at CanPod1 for the podcast, but I post these every so often. Like I have a model cannabis portfolio, and this is completely a shameless plug, but it also is really true. And something that I use to educate myself further in terms of, because I'm new to the investing game. I do not have decades of experience behind me.
plug away, yeah.
Is you can like literally put stocks in a portfolio and just play with it and see how it goes. So like if you, and that's how I started in terms of picking like what stocks I wanted in my portfolio. I put in a bunch, and then I would slowly like read more and more about as many as I could, and the more headlines that came out and the more things that came out about them, I slowly like whittled it down, and now it's at six with one on my watch list. So yeah, there's ways that you can just really enhance your own knowledge in a really kind of easy to like a bite size in bite size chunks. Like I don't think you have to take on the entire cannabis industry. Like you can focus on certain things and see how that does, like piece by piece.
Hmm. Well, let's dive a bit more into like the future, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, 2018 Farm Bill, industrial hemp in the U.S. is now legal to grow. So, what opportunities or even challenges do you see in the cannabis market now that industrial hemp is at play? Now that we can start making cars and houses and clothes out of this plant.
Yeah, I just saw this really awesome thing in Morocco that it was the first sustainably built hemp house that's like solar paneled, and it looks super cool. So a ton of opportunity out there. I would say just to kind of like follow up on the due diligence. Also very true in the hemp space. I mean, it's all cannabis, but in terms of like hemp specifically and CBD, I think that was also really exciting for people, especially people that are fans of cannabinoids and kind of already knew maybe the benefits of them. I think it was really exciting, but a lot of bad faith actors come up when things go legal and when markets are about to explode. And I would say this is no different. So a lot of things to beware for in general, I would say, in the CBD market, in terms of what you ingest, but also in terms of what you invest in. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think I myself get a lot of differing opinions on the hemp and CBD world. A lot of people think it's so oversaturated, it's impossible at this point to find out who is going to be like the bigger players in the CBD market. Um, Obviously, like Charlotte's Web is the biggest name. I think they have probably the most identifiable, I think, CBD brand out there. CBDMD, which you mentioned, they were one of the first sponsors on our podcast. Actually, I interviewed the founders, and that's a great company. I mean, who were you saying spot? Oh, that they partnered with your gym. They also partner with like Bubba Watson and the Big Three.
Yeah, they're real active in the extreme sports space. So like I know UFC, they're sponsored with the UFC. or they sponsor some athletes, I should say, from the UFC, as well as NFL players and so on. So yes, yeah, they're big on health.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they're big on health and wellness, and I think big on the athletic community. I think they're trying to like carve out that space, and also in the pet CBD world, they're also growing there, and also they trade on a major exchange, which is like a huge deal, and gives a lot of investors that are maybe scared of trading on the pink sheets. It gives them a little bit more cushion of belief, I think. But yeah, I mean, look, in general, if you're talking about like how it affects the cannabis industry, I don't think anybody's going to complain about, hemp being legal in the with the farm bill. I think it's good for the industry. I think it shows, first of all, it shows to many more people the versatility of hemp as, like you're saying, an industrial material. It's so versatile. It's been in use for, since the beginning of time, pretty much. Since people were using materials, I think people were using hemp. And probably some of that is still exists today because it's so durable. Yeah, so I think CBD in a lot of ways is kind of like people's way into more of the THC based cannabis, because I think it furthers people's understanding of, wow, this plant really has a lot to offer. It's not just THC, it's not just, the archaic notion of what it meant to get high and partake in cannabis. I think it exposes people to kind of like the bigger picture of what the plant is and how beneficial it can be. And I think if you're talking about investing, I mean, I think 10 years, maybe 5, 10 years from now, it's going to be like a commodity just like everything else, and it will be traded like a commodity like anything else. So I think it's super exciting. I think it just, again, like if you are the kind of person that looks at things half full, I would say the regulations are working themselves out, and it takes people a long time to understand what kind of regulations we need to be having and how to kind of suss out the bad players from the good players. And if you're of that mindset, I would say the FDA is on the right path. And, in Canada, if you're talking about Health Canada, and then if you're a little bit more pessimistic, you might say, why can't they figure it out faster? What is taking so long? It's just a plant. I probably fall somewhere in between those two. But yeah, I think it's anytime we're talking about accepting and understanding more of the plant, I think it's a good thing. So and further enhances kind of cannabis's reputation, I think.
Yeah. That might be the most frequently used term on this podcast so far is it's just a plant. So many guests say that. But you mentioned the two cannabinoids, THC and CBD, but we're just scratching the surface, right? Because there's 150 cannabinoids in the entire plant that we've identified, and we only know of, I think, 14 or 15 of them. So,
Yeah.
to your point, of that farm bill being passed, there's just so much opportunity for learning and growth and understanding the medicinal benefits and what these cannabinoids can do, and it's exciting.
It is exciting. It is exciting. Yeah. I'm sure you hear also just like all the things that companies are developing like right now based on like CPG or, things they're just starting to understand, like how we can have like such focused and targeted approaches with cannabis. I mean, it's really kind of like, it's just a plant, but it's a pretty magic plant, I mean, it's really wild.
It's the buffalo of plants. There's no waste, which is an incredible thing. Well, when you talk about going back to the challenges of the legalities and the regulations that are in place, also what I'm seeing in the industrial hemp industry is these companies like the market's not ready for itself almost, because you have
Yeah.
have farmers that are pivoting, and they're seasoned farmers that know how to grow things. They know how to grow plants, so they can easily grow hemp indoor or outdoor. But the problem is a lot of these companies aren't vertically integrated, so you've got gaps. You're sitting on a ton of hemp plants, but where are those processors to extract the oils and get the oils out so that you can then package them up and sell them as edibles or tinctures or whatever. So like you said, it's just evolving. We're at the front stages, but that's what's so exciting about it, and that's why podcasts like yours are so beneficial, especially from a financial standpoint, from someone who really wants to capitalize on what's happening, when it comes to cannabis.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, we had like Derek Duchesne, who's the president of Exactus, which is a company that just pivoted into the hemp space. And we've had a couple of companies that have pivoted to the hemp space. And, it's essential that they kind of have legacy growers helping them understand best practices, especially obviously, if they're growing like THC cannabis side by side hemp, there's all these problems that are involved there. But something Derek mentioned on the podcast that I found so interesting was this notion of once it opens up globally. Actually, I don't know if this was Derek. It might have been, sorry, Danny Mearslode, who's a THC grower, and he was talking about once it opens up globally, like being able to tap into the global marketplace of growers in Thailand and their best practices who have been growing for millennia and sharing it with people who have been growing it in Australia, and just like it evolves the knowledge of how to grow hemp in the best way and helps kind of the entire ecosystem. So anyways, I think the more we open it up, I think the better and better the whole industry becomes.
No, I agree. And imagine the cloning opportunities, like the climate in Australia or in Israel or wherever, right, is different than Texas. And so, I mean, the ways in which we can all evolve and learn together and crossbreed and clone and do different things is just it's going to be insane. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
so I want to touch on one other topic, and that is you mentioned that Israel was talking about decriminalization, right? And um, of possession. Is that right? I want to make sure I get that
Yeah,
correct.
yeah, that's right. Of up to 15 grams, yeah.
50 grand. And that seems to be the first step in the states. When it seems like first it's decriminalization, then they become a medical license state or medical cannabis state, and then you go full recreation. So
Hmm.
the first step, decriminalization, is very important because we know, especially in the United States, the number of incarcerations, right, and how many people are being locked up for this cannabis possession or sale, and yet during COVID, these businesses are deemed essential. So I noticed that you posted something on LinkedIn about that, and I also saw a tweet from Elon Musk uh, echoing the same idea in that it doesn't make sense, you know.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about that. Go ahead and tell me your thoughts on that post that you made.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to talk about it for a while. It obviously, predates my entry into covering the cannabis sector. Just mentioning Elon Musk's tweet, Steve DeAngelo, who I'm sure you're familiar with, as the founder of Harborside and a huge, cannabis activist and, one of the grandfathers of the industry or fathers of the industry. He said Elon Musk, he should be supporting the Last Prisoner Project, which is something Steve also started in terms of, getting these prisoners. I hate to even call them prisoners, but they are in prison, for these cannabis offenses is horrifying. So Elon Musk, if he has that platform and he believes in it, he should be like piggybacking people to real reform. So I also tweeted that to him and also to Joe Rogan, and to try and get people who are speaking about the injustice in a small way to kind of like really broaden that voice, because it is it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. And I did post something on LinkedIn in terms of trying to wrap our head, especially those of us who cover the big business and the legal cannabis scene. to read what's going on, what's been going on in the black market. It's been the black market for longer than it's been legal. And just what happens to those people. And I was on the last podcast, I also did, I think it was by a group called accountability.us, who compiles all these statistics about cannabis offenders sitting in prison, and especially now during COVID, where they've come up with this, for nonviolent offenders to be able to serve out the rest of their sentence at home. And there was somebody in jail for like over 25 years, completely nonviolent, just because of cannabis. And he was like 69 years old, and he was the model person to be on this like track to be able to serve the rest of his sentence at home. And he died, before he was able to do that.
Ugh.
I did read last week that another prisoner was allowed to do that, but it's horrifying. And the fact that they're even in jail to begin with is horrifying. The fact that they're in there for years and decades, and it's ridiculous and horrifying. And, it's something that I try in my own small way to amplify and to get people, I guess, horrified enough to do their own part. There's a lot of places that we can give our money to. And I think, yeah, we just need to keep talking about it, and in our own ways, pushing people that do have the power. I do, in my own way, try to push as much as I can, people running these big companies in terms of what they're doing practically, in terms of not just stopping, look, there's a lot of laws that are coming that have this social equity component in them. Illinois, I was born and raised in Illinois, so I was proud of the fact that they had such a big part of the social equity component there. But it's definitely not enough, and it's not in all states. And honestly, it should just be people in jail for cannabis should be let out of jail, period. I mean, it really should be that easy. Yeah, I feel like we're getting somewhere good, but it's a hard process. And there are people that it's obviously much harder for than just to be horrified by it, to be somebody that's living through that is, uncomprehendable to me.
Yeah, I think what you said about releasing those offenders from prison would alleviate a lot of issues in a way. I mean, these prisoners are stacked on top of each other to begin with. For petty offenses that in some states are deemed legal, right? It just is insane.
Yeah.
So the reform needs to happen, but it's good that you're putting the message out and bringing awareness to that fact, because things needs to change for sure, especially at the federal level.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. Well, Rena, I mean, we've talked for almost an hour. If you wanna leave the audience with anything else, the floor is yours. If you want to plug any social media channels, now's the time to do so as well.
Thank you. Well, I do want to say I feel like I could go even another hour. This was super enjoyable conversation. It's nice to be on the other side of things. But I really enjoyed this conversation. So first of all, thank you, Kevin, for having me on. Really happy to talk to you and connect to more purveyors of cannabis content, people doing a good job in the industry. It's great to see. And then, yeah, in terms of, so our podcast is called the Cannabis Investing Podcast. You can listen to it on everywhere you would listen to your podcasts. You can also read transcripts of those podcasts on Seeking Alpha. Again, it's called the Cannabis Investing Podcast. I tweet at CanPod1 on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can shoot me a message, ask me a question. Happy for you to listen to the podcast and ask me anything, or just ask me anything about the cannabis world. And if you want to write for us at Seeking Alpha, I would love to get your content if you think you have something to say, especially about the cannabis world. So I would love to hear from those willing to talk.
Love it. And no bullshit. Seeking Alpha is a great resource for any type of investing. But specifically, the Cannabis Investing podcast is awesome. And Rena, you do a great job of keeping everybody informed as to what's happening in the industry, both in the US and globally. So we appreciate what you're doing and keep up the great work.
Appreciate it, Kevin, and you too. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Yes, yes. We want to have you on again as the market develops, and I'm sure that things will change after the election. So
Yeah, here's hoping there's an election to be had. Yeah.
exactly. If the world doesn't blow up before then, we'll see. Fingers
Yeah,
crossed.
yeah,
But
yeah. Well, if we're still here, hope to continue the conversation. But great to talk to you today. Really appreciate it.
you as well, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time. All right, bye, guys.